As I was listening to all of you talk and sort of hearing the sort of, I mean, how the pieces are very complementary, and I was sort of like trying to put it in my head. There's this move toward restorative justice, and there's also these sort of policies and interventions to try to build in the alternative, the integrative justice, so looking at these pieces. And then there's this question around how people get in the justice system in the first place, right? Like before it's like, you know, there's the profiling and I mean we're not, and I'm not even talking about people with problems, you know, which we have to figure out that whole pipeline of support, right? The what can I do for you from birth, but also just the level of ways in which the surveillance and the you know, and having kids of color, you know, my kids, and having a son who's 6'3" and scary, and the extent to which he gets engaged in the criminal justice system just by walking around, just by living his life, doing the things that a white kid could walk to the store or do whatever and never interact with the police, and just his basic motion, right, has him engage with the so-called justice system in ways that just doesn't even make sense, right? So I wonder if you have any thoughts about policing. Yes.
Actually, we're working on a module for the police academy, and we now have a police officer on the board of RJOY, so that he can start hearing some of the things that are coming up. We had actually at one board meeting, we had this really interesting interaction between the board member from the police department and a young man who was also just joined the board. It's like 22, and was hanging out on a corner with his friends and was harassed by the police. And interestingly, he didn't want that police officer to be punished or lose his job, but wanted him to come into our circle and be able to hear what the effect of his behavior was on this young man. So having that kind of discussion as a transition to making that not happen anymore, you know, because we have to figure out a way to transition it. You know, it's not going to stop just because we say it's horrible. You have to really change people's mindset, and this format of these circles really seems to transform people's behavior, and that's what's so exciting about it. But
And then I want to do a follow-up, because especially for you to talk to. So there's this question of transforming police behavior through these pieces, and I think about this situation when I was in New Orleans, and these kids were outside playing basketball. They were stopped by the police as if it wasn't clear what they were doing, right? They were playing basketball, right? And the police stopped them. They because there was rules around that was never discussed by city council, but that there was a policy of rounding up kids who were in a different neighborhood, because it was a problem for kids of different neighborhoods to be in the same place, right? And then there was a problem and then so the police were talking to the kids. Somebody comes out and says, what's going on? Actually, a grandmother. The grandmother gets cursed out by the police. And then it becomes like this situation where it becomes a roundup of arrests and you know, and all these other kinds of things. So part of it is like definitely training, and then it feels like there's also a role of what the rules are, you know, that you know, and what the accountability mechanisms are for police too. And I know, Nikki, you're about to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that a lot of it's centered around very conscious, before it even gets down to the individual police officer point, very conscious decisions by law enforcement, upper echelon law policies, all geared around the war on drugs and where it's going to be fought. There's no issue that every community has drug issues. Every single community does. There's a conscious political decision to deploy the majority of law enforcement resources to communities of color. So what happens there? Exactly what you said there. They're elevated stops or whatever by police. There's invariably attitudes are going to happen and come, and then that escalates to something else, and it escalates to something else, and it becomes this this vicious cycle. Wherever there's crime in every community, But if the majority of the police are going to be in one community, they're going to pick up the crime that's there, either crime or even non-crime. They're going to pick up something, as opposed to the same issues happening in other communities, but that's not where the law enforcement focus is, okay? And then you get into a situation where people have elevated criminal histories as a result, which leads to more stringent sentencing, and it just cycles all the way around.
I also wanted to add that because we've done this work at the national level, state level, and local level, really the only way to impact this is at local level jurisdictions. Because you can make a lot of national policies and state policies, but really the way you break it apart is by looking at the local data. It's policies to a certain degree. It could be individual discretionary decision making, but it's also policies that are made, and the only way you're going to realize what policies are in fact impacting the DMC, you won't have any concrete place of where to go to try to change a policy. And there's a difference also, and I want to be really clear, between disproportionality and disparity. So the disproportionality is when we're talking about the percentages of youth out in the general population versus their percentages in detention. And those, the deeper you go into the system, the higher the disproportionality gets for youth of color. Disparity goes to the place of two kids get stopped for the same crime, control everything else, and the kid of color will inevitably go deeper into the system and do more time, be deeper into the system. So all of this, really, you have to really move away from anecdotal thought about this and really be data-driven. That's the only way you can really break it apart and be able to tell where in the because the juvenile justice system is everything from arrest to who gets petitioned to who gets sent to diversion, and our kids ain't being sent to diversion, who gets placed in detention, who gets sent to probation, to intensive probation, and then finally the correctional. All along, if you look at that spectrum, the disproportionality continues to get worse for kids of color.
Can I ask that just a clarifying? I don't understand these 5 steps you just said. You said diversion and detention, and could you explain this just a little bit so I have my head around it? I don't really understand it.
The juvenile justice system uses a different legal terminology than for the adult system. So referral can also is equivalent to arrest. At that point, you send that referral to the county attorney's office, and they'll decide whether they're going to petition it or not, whether there's enough of a case there to take that kid further into the system.
And that's like charging. Like
Right,
okay.
right. Next to that is then diversion. Whether that kid, this was the first offense, so we're going to send him or her to this particular program where all he's going to do is some community service time, write a letter, and off you go, right? And then next to that comes detention, whether you're at risk of reoffending or not appearing in court. Those are the only 2 reasons why any kid would be detained, except for certain states which add whether you're in danger to yourself or others. And so then if any of those put you in high risk, then you would be detained. That would be the place where you're detained. Parents not being at home is reason why to detain you, okay? Mm-hmm.
But what we're trying to do in Alameda County is at the diversion step to really focus most of the young people into not a diversion where it's just a community service that might be unrelated to what happened, but these kinds of circles where you really examine closely with the community members who are involved what happened in this situation, why did it happen, where's community responsibility, where's individual responsibility, and how do we start fixing that so that you really do keep them out of the system in as many situations as possible.